Welcome to CTO Crossfire. My name is Anthony Giuliano. I'll be your host today. On my right, we have Andrew Stanley. Andrew, please introduce yourself.
Andrew Stanley, Chief Technology Officer for Mars Incorporated.
And of course, representing the left, Rajan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rajan Mehta, Chief Product and Technology Officer for WWE.
So the rules for today, gentlemen, no kicking, no biting. Please, no hair pulling.
We got that one covered.
Fair enough. No, but in all seriousness, I think there's about 4 different topics I want to cover, and we'll see how much time we have to do it, and maybe there are a couple of others to jump into. But when I look at a lot of the stuff we talk about when we get on these panels, it's like, well, what are you doing in cloud? And, oh, well, how are you doing things with data? And it's like, well, no, I don't really want to know all of those things all the time. I want to talk about organizational politics. I want to talk about career changes. I want to talk about adapting to new situations, the Great Resignation, and all of the things that are coming with that. And I also want to talk about handling crisis. There might be a few other topics if we have time, and we'll get into it. But let me maybe start with organizational politics. So both of you are in very esteemed leadership positions. I think there's always a challenge. How do you keep people motivated? How do you actually handle and lead teams effectively, especially when, in the context of technology, a lot of things change. So first, Rajan, I'll let you maybe give, what are your tips and tricks? What are the things that you do to essentially lead teams, and how do you manage some of those organizational politics around motivation and around interactions and difficult kind of conversations?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things on being a technology leader is partnering with the non-technology folks in your company, right? That's the one thing that stands out all the time. And you got to build that trust. Sometimes it takes time, but that's like one of the key aspects of it. What I found in the tech org specifically is that people understand the technology really well, but they don't necessarily know what's happening across our company, right? So when you look at how are we going to grow revenue, that's not top of mind for people sometimes in the tech org. And so what I found as one of the things that's valuable for me and leading the teams is making sure that they know what's going on in the company. And depending on the size of the company, at 20,000 or someplace like us that's 1,000 people, it's tough to get that info out there. So I found that to be one of the most motivating thing of, hey, where are we going, right? Everyone needs to know where we're going because that also helps motivate people.
Counterpoint, Andrew.
So I think you're...
You can't really disagree with that, I feel like.
I mean, I could pick a fight.
I like it. Let's do it.
No,
I'm the wrestling guy, so you got to be careful on that.
It is. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Hey.
Somebody wants to come in the rig and see how fake it is.
This got off the rails so quick.
Yeah, it really did. I mean, so all politics is context, right? Sure. It's individual behaviors either without context or in ignorance of context. So the vast majority of my job is helping people gain context. I haven't been a technologist for, 20 years. I write PowerPoints for a living. I write emails. I pick fights over team calls. My team needs the context from the rooms that they do not have access to, right? By virtue of our titles, many of us get invited to meetings, venues, interactions that your frontline engineer who actually keeps your company running doesn't get access to. So I spend a great deal of my time trying to be a relay. Here's what we're talking about. Here's why it matters to you. What do I need to be advocating for you on your behalf? Because if I can provide that context, it breaks down a lot of the political boundaries that exist within technology organizations today.
So I'm actually going to create that is a counterpoint, and I'll explain why. So I think what you've kind of said is, you have to have that relationship with the business partners, and I get the feeling that's more the business leadership, the people that are really kind of at the top of the organization. And I think what you're saying is you need to be the relay from the top to the bottom to make sure that they understand the vision of where they're marching. Now, I'm sure you both agree that both are good, strategies, but, am I characterizing that right in the terms of, what's kind of the right approach for you?
Yeah, so I would say it's both of them. And the reason I led with the business partner piece is that I wouldn't be able to explain to the people on my team what was happening with the business if I wasn't in the room with those folks. So to me, that came first.
The communication.
That's
what we
piece,
agree.
right? Like when, if we're looking at putting a new business model in the United Kingdom, right? I want to be part of that conversation because technology is a key part to enable that. If I find out after the fact then it's me trying to catch up and kind of communicating to the team, oh, we did this because X, Y, Z reason. We didn't do this part of the technology because we didn't know, right? And that part to me is like, you got to get ahead of it, because that's really where, as you communicate with your team, you're able to say how we got to these decisions and why, because that why is really important.
Yeah, and maybe a follow-up question there too, right? When I think about the technology aspect of it, in some situations, I feel like the board almost doesn't care, right? Like, does the board really need to know what was plugged in where and who did what and how many developers are working on X or Y? So how do you characterize that board level conversation from that manage up perspective? What are the real tactical ways you communicate it? Is it dollars and cents? Is it efficiency? Is it everything, all of the above? Like, what's the strategy?
Look, so the first thing, if the board doesn't care, it's candidly my fault that they didn't care. Right? It's not their fault. It's how I've always looked at it, because that means I didn't explain it properly to the board for them to understand that it is relevant, right? So that's like the first piece on any like technologist or cybersecurity leader says, oh, our board doesn't care. I'm like, then you got to do a better job communicating it, because you're doing something wrong, right? So that's the first piece to keep in mind. Then it goes, what does matter for your business, right? Does it matter that you have 27 help desk folks versus 30? Probably not at the board level, right? So those are the types of things you have to kind of work with the board of what's critical. So how are you growing your business? How is technology enabling it? IT is a big cost component of any company. So how are you managing those costs? And then cybersecurity being that other third piece that every single board member should care about.
How do you know what the board wants?
You manufacture it, right? I mean, I genuinely believe that. Most board members are there because they were exceptional business leaders. They know how to govern an enterprise. They understand financial mechanics, or they understand something that's strategic to the enterprise. Outside of that, the vast majority of them are not there because of our capability. Right now, when I was full-time CISO, of course they were interested in what I was doing because it fit under the governance umbrella, but it was still tangential in a lot of ways. So in my opinion, for the board to really, truly care, you have to manufacture it. You have to work with them to build a compelling case, to sell your board members on why is this relevant to the business. Ensure you have the support of your officer level stakeholders like your CFO, your CEO, et cetera, and keep their attention. Keep their attention through topics that they connect with, that they believe is an act of preserving shareholder value or guiding the CEO in their job success. The best piece of advice I ever received from a board member, a guy named Jack Ty, now retired, served on a whole bunch of boards, former executive at Deutsche Bank. He said to me, his job is to help the CEO succeed. Anything outside of that job, and he's not doing his job. So if I'm in the room, I have to be coaching them on ways that they can help my CEO succeed.
I like that is a dichotomy, because I think to a certain extent you're thinking about how do I pull the information from the board to be able to then position it, whereas I think it's a little bit more, almost that kind of I manufacture it. And I think I side more on that. I mean, realistically, how much of your budget, how many projects are so focused on things like, well, we're moving to the cloud, we're doing a lot of patching, we're doing a lot of fundamental core IT things, and it does eat up a lot of cost, both at an OpEx and a CapEx level, and then there's some sexy stuff that's maybe the 20%, and you really want to showcase the 20% sexy stuff because that's what generates revenue, right? So you have to manufacture that story. Now, I don't know if you would disagree explicitly with that, but as I see it, maybe there's more manufacturing to it than kind of, finding out what they want.
I wouldn't use the term manufacturing, but I do think that the board...
He's in manufacturing.
I think what happens in technology, which was the point earlier, the board at times do not know what to ask. Right? Let's take cybersecurity for example. There's not cybersecurity experts on most boards. So they will look at your technology leader or your CISO to say what is important. Right? So that kind of a piece of how do you provide that information and explaining why it is important is critical. Then a second piece on that one, and I think any strong technology leader should be doing this, is there's this check and balance. And when you're providing the information to the board, you no longer are creating that check and balance, and you need to be transparent to the board about that. And what things can you do, whether it's with audit practices, that provides that check and balance, because I think that helps also get the trust of your colleagues, and I think that's an important aspect of it.
I think what we're really talking about here is how do you sell the concepts and the value of what you're doing back to others, whether it's up or down, it's to the board, it's to the shareholders. And I think you both have different, equally valuable styles of how to do that sales process, and I feel like that's a really interesting point. Let's move on to the next topic. I think you hit the nail on the head a little bit earlier, the difference between having a CISO conversation at the board versus now CTO. And I know you've had a few different kind of career growth and trajectory and changes as you've moved from, I'll call it more technology focused to digital to product. Both of you have had growth out of what was probably more of a technology pigeonholed role into a broader role. As you've gone through a lot of that growth, I'm just curious, what have you had to adapt to and change in your role? You were previously CISO, now CTO, and you were previously technology, now full product. What have you had to adapt and change in your style of execution now that you've taken on that bigger role? Rajan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so being on the consumer, I manage both the consumer side and the enterprise side, and it's vastly different, right? We are a company that's based heavily on live television, live programming, live events, and if you do not make a date, you miss the show, right? So there is an element of time sensitivity that is different than what an IT project would be, where if you had a delay on your cloud migration, you're going to have a cost associated with it, but it's not going to be business impactful. So when you're kind of managing those two worlds and spending a lot of time on what's now we're referring to as the business side of what you do, it changes the game because there's a revenue impact on everything that you do.
You used to be cost, now you're profit.
And that's impactful. And that goes back to the earlier conversation that we had too.
Yeah, I think for me, it's keeping stakeholders interested in something that is completely uninteresting to them, right? Security is very interesting to many people. Unfortunately, at my firm, we had a massive cyber attack in 2017. In fact, it was that attack that got me hired at the company. So cyber issues are very, very front of mind for the majority of our associates, whether they be frontline engineering up through our C-suite. The more boring CTO side isn't as exciting to people. So I spend a lot of time burning my political capital that I earned as a CISO over the last 5 years to keep people interested in the CTO side of my job. And it's really the riskiest part of what I do. Everything else can blow up in my face. We have a massive systems outage. We can recover from that. But the strategy of the team really rests on my ability to leverage political capital to keep stakeholders engaged and willing to engage in the cost conversation, right?
Yeah, I feel like maybe the challenge, or asking it a different way, when you're a CISO, I think a lot of times, and not saying that you said this or that you say this, but many CISOs are always thinking about, well, there are these things I don't control, infrastructure, hygiene, things that are around the application processes, the developers, the talent. There's a lot of things that live in that CTO world that broader role really encapsulates that, I bet every CISO says, gosh, if I only owned that, I could tell them how to do it. Do you feel like you finally got that dream?
I mean, I think it's bullshit if a CISO says they don't own it when they don't put their fingers on the keyboard, right? And I genuinely believe that because it was my ass in front of the board that got beat when we had an issue, even if it was the patching person's fault somewhere. So, by that measure... Did you literally
have to go to that level, at the board level, in order to, make that apparent when those things weren't going right?
Well, I had to represent the performance of the team relative to how we were measured, how we were audited, et cetera. So if we were, we had a bad patching audit 3 years in a row, that was then considered a control breach, which then got reported to the board.
That's on you, not on them.
Exactly. So, flipping over to the side where I own it, I think for me was easier because I spent 5 years telling both teams they both own it. It doesn't matter which VP you report to, you both own it. It's just someone else gets to get the credit and someone else gets to get in trouble when things go right. Patching goes right, board doesn't give me any credit. The CEO doesn't give me any credit. On the flip side, that goes wrong, I get the punishment. So it was trying to build that culture amongst my vice presidents that really unlocked it.
It always makes me wonder why people even want to be a CISO, to be honest. But
money?
That's actually probably the real reason.
Guaranteed job?
Fair. We'll come back to that. Rajan, so for you, you've been there now 9 years. You've inherited, as you mentioned, kind of the revenue side in addition to now the, I'll call it cost side. Is there any moment of be careful what you wish for? I mean, you kind of inherited it, and now there was a pandemic, and then also a little bit of a recession. So, like, do people look and say, "Hey, the revenue's down," and guess what? It's on you. Like, how do you deal with that? Is that something that's kind of come to mind, or you know what? Actually, grass was really greener, and now we have revenue, and now I'm good.
I think part of the pieces of inheriting it or putting it together was there was a lot of optimizations, right? And when you look at different aspects of technology across a company that's 1,000 people, it just didn't make sense. So from that perspective, there's still been benefits, and so even if you go through some of those other aspects where revenue is down, that's not our case in our scenario, so it's been pretty positive. Yeah, one of the few that kind of went up during that period and stayed that way. So we haven't had that specific challenge, but the optimizations that we put by putting all the technology together, and for those who aren't aware, what we had at WWE is we had a lot of different technology functions, about 3 or 4 that were operating, kind of going all up through different verticals. And what we put together was let's put it all together, and I put the plan together of why it made sense, how it would help the company, and we're a few years into it, and it's working out pretty well.
Cool. Next topic. Last year's big term was the Great Resignation. I think this year's big term is quiet quitting. I kind of think both of these terms are bullshit. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong.
Tell me more.
I think that people have been unhappy in modern workforces for some time. They just really recognized
Since the modern workforce existed, yeah.
Well, since the modern technology workforce really came into play, I'd say like 98 through 2000, right? Where you saw the retirement of the mainframe generation, and you saw the coming up of the client server generation, to be awfully binary about it. And you had concepts of remote work, you had higher time demands, and you deployed systems that were inherently less stable, right? How many mainframe folks had a massive mainframe outage in their career? Maybe one. How many client server folks had a major production outage? Once a month, right? We adopted technologies that were thought scaled, they just scaled in a very messy manner. So I think that we have had a structural exhaustion for some time that we just overlooked because we lived a rote life. Got up in the morning, drove to work, did work, drove home. The pandemic put into focus, wait a second, there is this other life I had that I have largely not paid attention to. If you're living here in New York City, commuting 3 hours a day, and suddenly you got that 3 hours back, it's like, wait a second, what's the contract here at my job between my effort and then the lifestyle I want? And I think that really just came to light. And I think that it is bullshit to say that we've had a great resignation. I think we've just had lots of job turnover. People hired gangbusters at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. So of course you're going to resign, right? You're going to get the new job. You're going to go for the brass ring. Other way around, quiet quitting. I think we've had productivity problems for a long time. And now we can just measure it. Right? Now we've got some insights tool, we've got Terramind, we've got Microsoft Viva, we've got all these things that allow us to measure it, and people are more comfortable talking about it. Reddit is a great place to complain about how much you hate your job. And therefore it gets covered on CNBC.
Yeah, fair.
I think some people have always hated their job, some people always love their job, and I don't think that's changed. I do think the opportunity for people not having to come into the office every day changed people's minds. I have probably a disagreement on if more people are resigning. I think more people are resigning now, but I also think it's because other jobs are available, to what your point was. So, those things kind of go hand in hand. If there's a ton of tech jobs out there, people are going to resign. But I also think people, who are able to look back and reflect and go, look, I don't really like it here.
I think there's also just simple math, stupid things that nobody really looks at. So for example, it's March of 2020, it's been declared a pandemic. Are you going to quit? No, I'm going to hold on to my job for as long as I can, whether I hated it or not.
100%.
I'm going to wait and see how the next 6 months turn out and whether companies are going to go out of business or not. And then at the end of that, all of a sudden, hey, by the way, there's a ton of people needing to hire because they got rid of contractors, they got rid of consultants, and there's a lot of opportunity. And now that pent-up demand where people didn't quit now it just gets unleashed over the course of a 3-month period. And now we get to call it a great resignation, when in reality, it's standard churn.
Look, I think it's a better calling it a great resignation because now we're talking about it.
Well, that's true.
Right?
Maybe that was the point.
That becomes part of the piece here, and it's cyclical. I think there's going to be it's going to go the other way.
Maybe that's the point. Talk to me about quiet quitting.
I think it's the same thing. I think you have the same folks, and I think there's less jobs available as things kind of, as people are having some layoffs out there. You have people who are just disengaged. We were talking about this the other day of, folks who are coming in the office on Friday and those who are not coming in on the office on Friday. I'm not convinced the folks coming in on Friday are more productive than the ones that aren't, because if they don't want to work from home on Friday, they're not going to do it in the office. And you had that back in the day too, where you walk by someone's desk and they're streaming Hulu. Like that happens. Now it's just we're talking about it more.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
We have really quick time for one last topic, which is the conversation around handling crisis. Ironically, this is probably the most complex conversation to have, and we're jamming it into a very minimal amount of time. I think realistically, there are a lot of crises that are facing us today. When I look at, war erupts in Eastern Europe. Okay, great. Now what do we do about that? I'm sure that affected, the things that you're working on. I think WWE has been in the news a couple of times recently. I'm sure there's some, level of crisis that gets kind of arranged around that. How do you handle crisis? What do you do to be the calming force in the middle of a whole lot of tumult and swirl and all the things going on? Rajan, please start.
Yeah, obviously not going to talk about any specific things here, but I would say the most important thing, it goes back to the first thing I was saying, is communication, right? Because we're, as leaders, in the room, and you understand what's happening. So the other hundreds of folks who work for you are not, right? And when they're not, there creates some uncertainty, and it's our jobs to be very transparent and honest of what the situation is. And I think in crisis, like, you put together your BCP plans, you do all those pieces, but the most important piece is the communication. You don't want to step over each other. You don't want to seem dishonest with the people that you work with. You got to be transparent.
Keep people inspired to sacrifice, right? Major crisis means you have people working extra hours, going outside their lane, having additional stress, doing any number of things more often and more aggressively. And if you can keep people inspired to sacrifice, then you can get people to sacrifice. You can create stability in your area where everybody else may be running around like a chicken with their head cut off.
I love it, and I bet that goes back to communication too. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. This has been CTO Crossfire.